Awesome. Okay.
Okay.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Longhouse. This is our second Longhouse for the year, second Longhouse to be held online, second Longhouse to go right across the country. Today's topic is Grant Writing 101, presented by Andrea Lim. My name is Arisa Yura. I am the Longhouse coordinator for 2020, and I'll be your facilitator tonight. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I wish to express my respect for all First Nations peoples today. For those of you who are new to joining us, welcome. A quick rundown on who we are. Contemporary Asian Australian Performance. You may have seen us shorten our name to CAAP. We are a professional arts organisation led by executive producer Annette Chunwo. We develop, support and champion Asian Australian artists and performance by providing pathways to a more resilient, more diverse, enriching community. You've currently tuned into our Longhouse program. The Longhouse program consists of panel discussions and seminars designed to allow our community to share information, network, and build the community. We are aiming to provide skills and inspiration for artists and leaders in the industry. Attendance for tonight's workshop is free. However, we encourage you to support CAAP'S work by donation if you can. Every dollar donated before 31st of January 2021 will be matched dollar for dollar by Creative Partnerships Australia's +1 program, which means your support has double impact. Link is in our chat box coming up. Before we delve into tonight's topic, I'd like to quickly explain a few things that might help you to engage this workshop. One of the major differences from our last Longhouse is you might be able to see your fellow attendees' beautiful faces, depending on whether you are on gallery view or speaker view. The view can be found on the top right-hand corner. It's so fantastic to see some of your faces. Just make sure that your microphone is muted during Andrea's session. That would be terrific. And once Andrea starts speaking, using speaker view mode will allow you to see Andrea and her slides clearly. This session will be recorded and an edited recording will be made available to attendees only, along with a transcript in English. Please feel free to use the chat section throughout to ask questions to Andrea and to connect with each other. Please be respectful in the chat. Lastly, there will be a 5-minute Q&A at the end of the session. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, but if we're not able to get to all the questions, Andrea has kindly offered to answer them via email. Without further ado, let's introduce tonight's guest contributor, Andrea Lim. Andrea Lim is a Sydney-based Singaporean-born cultural and community development worker who is passionate about arts-based initiatives for social justice and creating alternative spaces for BIPOC emerging artists. Along with our 5 other wonderful panelists, Andrea generated a great response when she spoke at our first national Longhouse, the Longhouse Gathers in May. We are thrilled to have her back as we wanted to hear more of Andrea's perspective on grant writing tips and learn from her expertise. Welcome back, Andrea.
Hi, thank you so much. I would like to thank CAAP for inviting me to speak at this workshop and share more of what I know. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people on whose land I live on. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and that sovereignty was never ceded. I also want to pay my respects to any Aboriginal people that might be here with us today. I think it's also important for us to reflect on our positionality as Asian settlers on this land and how we can take active steps to stand in solidarity with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Before we begin as well, I want to acknowledge that this is a really hard time for a lot of people, including artists. I know a lot of people are exhausted in this time, and I want to thank you for showing up. today and learning together. It is also difficult that, kind of even in a crisis, artists have to still apply for grants for emergency funds in a time where capacity for so many is kind of impacted. I know that grant writing is not exactly the most exciting thing for a lot of people, but I hope that the tools I provide you with will help ease the process. And think about grants and projects differently. I also want to mention before I begin that it still remains that knowledge about fundraising, navigating grants, and the arts industry is largely based on social capital. This is inequitable. The grant system is part of a larger system that gets to say what projects are worthy of funding or not. We also know that social inequities result in barriers to participation in the arts, and this is no different with the grant system. So sharing this information with emerging artists of color became really important to me. I say all of this before I begin because I want to ensure that through this workshop, we gain a bit of awareness of how overall grant funding systems work while we're also learning project planning and grant writing skills. So before we begin proper, if you don't already have a pen and a piece of paper, now is the time to grab them. Even if you have a computer or a laptop in front of you, you might want to refer to the slides and have some writing materials with you. So just on to the next slide. I will be trying to pack in these topics today. I'll go through the core grant application components, the types of grants most relevant to individual artists and small collectives, project planning foundations that can be applied almost to any project, forming partnerships, auspicing, and getting support letters, and then basic budgeting and some tips on gathering and putting together your support materials. So just on to the next slide. So here are some of the main components to any grant application. I place this up front because knowing this will generally help in the planning of any projects you are seeking grant funding for. So it's important to remember that grant writing is simply a way of communicating a project plan to a funder. In general, a lot of us struggle with it because we haven't fully thought through the plan for an idea that we are seeking grant funding for. The grant application form kind of forces you to think through why you're doing what you are doing, which is actually a good thing. Does the community actually need this? Is this the right time for this project? What am I trying to achieve here? If there is one major takeaway from this, it is to prioritize planning ahead of time. Now that you know that every grant requires, if you look down the list here, a description, goals and impact, a budget, supporting letters and materials, you can plan for this when you're turning an idea into a project plan before you're even looking at the grant application form. Just the next slide, please. So I put together sort of a project development cycle here for everyone. So you're looking at the first step being project planning. Then you're looking at grant selection after, partnerships and auspicing, supporting materials, and then you're writing and submitting your grants, and then we're going back to project planning again. So this is kind of a cycle that we can use in terms of the way that we develop our projects. So on to the next slide. All right. So as you can tell from the cycle, it's important you plan in advance. So do you know what projects are for the year? Do you have the ability to plan for some core projects and some responsive ones? Do you know what the budgets are for your projects? How much you will need to fundraise? Do you know when the opening and closing dates are? You can usually gauge these things from previous years. As we plan our projects, I think it's also important to think about motivations, intentions, and capacity to deliver. It is tempting to grab at projects, especially when responsive grant funding comes up. I think it's also important to give ourselves the opportunity to think about why we're doing what we are doing. Does this project fit in our overall direction? Are we ready for this project at this stage? If we aren't, what can we do in the time being to get to a point where we can be confident to deliver it? Have we planned rest, care for ourselves so that we can show up for ourselves and for the communities that we are working with? Do we have the capacity to hold space for difficult conversations or important conversations in our projects? So a calendar like the one above can be, incredibly helpful in mapping out grants for the entire year that you think you might apply for. And you can even map out the opening and closing dates, project timelines, and all of that here. So moving on to the type of grants available. And so here are some grant options that I pulled out because I felt like it's relevant if you're a newly emerging individual artist or a new collective. And I'm going to go down the list and speak to some of them. So project grants are for one-off projects. The funder might have different priorities. This might be for the development of new work or a research project or capacity building workshops, et cetera, et cetera. The next type of grant is the quick response grant. They're usually, but not always, open all year round. They're small grant amounts and are usually good for responsive projects. They're also a good option if you have already secured funding for a project, but require a small amount for other costs associated with the project. The next type of grant is the professional development grants. These are grants to further your own development in an artistic area, but also might have community benefit. A lot of people immediately categorize this as a course or conference, but you can also put a grant in for an applied form of professional development. For example, you and your chosen mentor could get a grant to work on a script for a play that you are planning to produce. This is a really good opportunity to learn from someone, pay them, pay yourself, while also getting the first phases or the different phases of your project done. The next sort of funding is scholarships. The word is kind of used interchangeably these days, but in general, they are linked to professional development opportunities that can be academic or non-academic in nature. Now, travel grants. These are grants that assist you with travel-associated costs and can also be used in combination with other grants mentioned above, depending on the budget of your project. So if you have like a $9,000 international project, you might apply for $5,000 through a quick response grant, and then $4,000 for travel, accommodation, or food. And lastly, these are the fellowship type of grants, and they're usually opportunities associated with larger sums of money for a longer period of time. It is usually given out so that an artist can focus on their craft and produce a substantial body of work. But as with any opportunity, the criteria varies based on specific guidelines. I want to say that all these grants mentioned are one-off grants. In general, most grants are. I mentioned this because it needs to be factored into your project planning process. If you are seeking funding for a one-off exhibition, that is okay, that is great. But if you are seeking funding for an ongoing program, you need to plan ahead so you know where your funds are coming from when your first grant runs out. For example, if you're running an ongoing writing circle and was successful for, a $5,000 grant to run your project till August 2020, it's important you know what other grants you will be applying for prior to that when your project ends to continue running the program. So at this point, you might be asking, why didn't the writing circle just apply for a $10,000 grant in the first place? If you are a newly emerging artist or collective, it can be quite difficult to attain big grants. And I will go into that a little later. Now I'm just going to go through the types of funders in the next slide. So government grants. So a large part of funding comes from government grants here, which are taxpayer dollars. Federal funding is very competitive. If you're newly emerging, my advice is to go for local and state government funding first. This will help you build up some project viability prior to a federal grant application. So local council grants are usually for projects that benefit the local community. Some local councils will only fund local artists within their government area. Others are okay if you are not within the local government area, but you're delivering a service to their residents. So it all depends. So my advice would be to find out which local government area you are in or connected to, and check out what grant opportunities they offer. Many local council grants and opportunities provide you with pathways to develop viability. State government grants range from small to larger amounts. For New South Wales, it's Create New South Wales, and some other relevant ones for the arts is also Multicultural New South Wales that administer project and event funding at larger amounts. So try and find your equivalents if you're based in other states. Federal funding is national. You're looking at everyone in this country requesting for funding. Yep. So now moving on to the next slide, which is philanthropy. The arts is also funded by philanthropic foundation grants. Much like any funding body, foundations have priorities and criteria that you have to meet. Sometimes these stay constant, but sometimes they change according to community needs, so you have to keep updated with it. The sector is split into corporate foundations. So this is your ANZ, Westpac foundations, large for-profit foundations. Private philanthropy, this is like Ian Potter Foundation, or a single person gives out funds that is managed by a foundation as an entity. Family foundations, this might be bequests that are left behind by family members that is given out to community. Community foundations, this is where a group of people with similar interests might come together and decide that they want to fund that particular interest area. So listed here are some foundations that fund art-related projects or professional development opportunities that I thought would be related to individual artists or small collectives. I also want to mention that it's important to check where your money is coming from and how it might fit with your own practice and the communities that you're seeking to serve. If you're forming a small collective, it's always good to think about your collective's values before you apply to philanthropic grants. Some philanthropic foundations might be investing in areas that your organization, its artists, your audience might not align with. So it's important that you make clear decisions on where your money comes from, as it can really have real repercussions on you and the communities that you're serving. My last point for this slide is that foundations require you to have DGR status to receive funds. Some foundations, but what is DGR? I'll explain on the next slide. So DGR stands for deductible gift receipt status. Many nonprofits or charities have this status. As sole traders, individuals, or a new collective, we usually do not have this status. I myself have not actually gone through the process of forming an organization to then get this status. However, if this is a requirement of the foundation that you are applying to, the Australian Cultural Fund, ACF, can assist individual artists with this. So all you have to do is to sign up, create a fundraising campaign. It kind of looks like a crowdfunding one, and this gives you this DGR status through the ACF. Philanthropic foundations can now grant you funds should you be successful at their grants. But I do want to reiterate that not all foundations require DGR status. Some of the ones that I listed above do not. So don't let that put you off. And in the next slide, I want to talk very briefly about crowdfunding, because I think that's a topic that comes up quite a lot with artists. So with crowdfunding, there are certain considerations to make. These campaigns are usually only successful if you already have a following and you have capacity to deliver the rewards you say you're going to deliver. So, you know, if someone gives you $10, you're going to design a postcard for them. It is important to consider realistic funding targets and take into account if the project is, you know, in the best position for a crowdfunding campaign, even if, you know, the platform that you're using doesn't require you to deliver rewards. If you have an existing audience, a crowdfunding campaign can be very successful. And also it can be a marketing tool for your project, for basically getting the word out about your project. It can also be quite successful if you're a collective of artists with different relationship groups and networks. But with crowdfunding, it's important to remember that it's hard to ask family and friends more than once a year. So it's important to decide if this is the right time for your campaign, or if phase 2 of your project is the better time, or phase 3, or further down the line. So just moving on to the next slide. I also want to share the overall landscape of where money comes from in the arts. So as you can see here, government grants form the largest pool for artists and arts organizations. This pool and targeted philanthropy is where you want to focus your efforts on when you're first starting out. And you know, with the corporate stuff, it really depends on whether you can find alignment, whether you have some sort of following as well, and mutual benefit. But that usually comes further down the line. So just moving on to the next slide. Grant rejections. Okay, now I really want to talk about this because grant rejection happens a lot. Particularly if you're new to running projects or new to grants. I say this because I know that it can be demoralizing. It can have really real impacts on mental health and self-worth. I want to say that so much of the time, this is not a reflection on you or your projects. There's so many factors, the applicant pool, more experienced applicants, etc., plus all the barriers to understanding grant writing. So if you are a first-time grant applicant or launching a new project, you know, grant funders might ask you questions like, tell us about your experience in running a project. And, you know, every grant funder will, you know, ask you these questions and get you to you know, show them that in your supporting material. These questions basically tell the funder about viability and your ability to successfully run something. But it becomes very difficult to do this if you are still newly emerging and you don't have you know, much under your belt yet. This is why knowing which grants to go for can be so crucial to build up some experience in order to support yourself in your future projects. I always recommend applying to professional development grants first. That is how I started. It might not be the same for everyone, but I know that we all have room to grow, and having someone to work with you, or sort of learning alongside someone kind of opens up different grant possibilities while still getting your project done. The other thing is to also think about your project in phases. If you're newly emerging, and you want to fund an entire player production, it's highly unlikely that one grant funder will give you $20,000. So knowing which grants to apply for is important. Now moving on to the next slide. So I'm just going to take you through this particular cycle. And so I'm just going to go through project planning foundations. If you attended the last Longhouse that I spoke at, there might be some overlap, so please bear with me. But we're going to be going one step further and applying the concepts this time. So just on the next slide, you will find so this is a simple table here to help in developing the foundation of your project. So you can plan almost any project with it. And basically this can be translated to your project description in your grant application very quickly. Your project description should always include a why in the first column, how, when, and what. So oftentimes I see the why missing, but the why is so crucial because it frames your project and the problem that you're trying to solve. The why question, can be worded in the application as the aim, the need, the problem, your goals. So, you have to look through the application and really figure out what they're asking for. The how is usually pretty easy because, we come up with ideas, but if you cannot articulate the need, you will then run into problems when they're asking you about impact. So going through this table, we have the problem that you're trying to solve in the first column, and that is the misrepresentation of Asian stories in theater. So I'm just using this as an example, and we will use this case throughout the presentation. The next column, how you're doing this. So a mentoring initiative for Asian emerging writers. There might be different hows. There's so many ways that we can, solve this particular problem. But for, in this instance, we're using a mentoring initiative. In the next column, you'll see what activities. So 12 mentoring sessions, you will produce 2 theater scripts and then 1 performance reading. The length of the program, 6 months, fortnightly. So moving on to the next slide. So you can see just based of that table there, I've come up with, a short project description. The mentoring initiative for Asian emerging writers aims to address the misrepresentation of Asian stories through guided mentorship over a 6-month period. 12 mentoring sessions will be delivered fortnightly, covering topics of X, Y, and Z, culminating in 2 scripts and doing a reading at Carriage Works. So moving on to the next slide here. So now if you take the when and the what from the previous table, and transfer it to a milestone table that will be coming up in the next slide, it actually helps you work out what resources you need for your project. So as you can see, depending on your project, your core program never comes first in your milestones. You need to factor in preparation time, marketing, planning. Most of the time, your core program only comes before your evaluation process. as a milestone. So if you have a look at this table, your first milestone here is planning. What this requires is research and development of mentoring materials. Your when can be figured out, if you work backwards from your mentoring sessions. So 4 weeks prior, 3 weeks prior, even longer, whatever, your project requires. And then in the next column, what are the resources for this particular milestone? So it might be time, it might be printing. And then you have your budget in your next column there. So, if this planning stage requires 10 hours at $50 an hour, then you have $500. And this becomes very crucial for when you then start to do your budget in your grant application. So just moving on to the next slide. So here's when you bring out your pen and paper. We're gonna try and do some application here. Just in the next slide, we're just gonna try and spend, 2 to 3 minutes thinking of one problem that you are trying to solve. If you really cannot think of anything, there's 2 examples here that you can work with. And we're gonna do a bit of sharing through the chat box in the next 5 minutes. So we'll just give everyone 3 minutes here. Okay, so just moving on from this slide. Now that you've got, I see some issues there that people are sharing. Now that you've got that particular problem, let's try and spend, some time, maybe just, 2 minutes or so, to work through these particular columns. And when you're done, feel free to share in the chat box some of, your short project descriptions if you're able to do that. I am conscious of time, so we're just gonna do this for about 2 minutes, and then I'll move on to the next few slides. I've also included examples at the bottom to help you generate that. Misrepresentation of Asian experience in the European operatic repertoire. I feel you, because like I am a musician, and I, you know, kind of studied classical music, and you know, the experiences there and the disparities and stuff kind of led me to what I'm doing today. Definitely, you know, that misrepresentation in operas it's quite harmful. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. We're kind of running out of time a little. So, you know, feel free to share things in the chat box as I move along. But I might move on now so that you get the most out of this workshop. So, impact measuring and evaluations. So grant funders give out grants because of the impact it makes on communities or the industry. So this is essential to understand because it will change the way you approach writing your grant. Most of the time, if the impact is solely about you and your artistic practice, your project might be difficult to get funded. Even if you're applying to a professional development grant, you need to articulate why funding you to attend a conference, for example, will in turn result in a positive impact on the communities that you are connected to. So every grant funder will ask for an acquittal report at the end of your project. An acquittal report tells the funder the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, learnings upon completion of your project. This means you have to think about evaluations and asking participants the right questions during your project. So this can be, you know, qualitative, so quotes from participants, or quantitative, numbers and stats. And you have to plan this out prior to running your program, because your funder is going to ask, what impact does your project make? In this question, it becomes very obvious to funders whether you have thought about how your project ties in with the needs of the communities. This is also the question where people start repeating themselves on why they, you know, want to do what they're doing. We don't want to do that. We want a clear, succinct answer. So at this point, I want to remind everyone that you have previously articulated a why, which is, you know, the problem that you're trying to solve. And that is linked to this impact question. So I'm going to go through some tools to help you with these in the next few slides. So before we go deeper into deriving at your impact, there's a couple of key terms that I want to go through. The first being inputs. So inputs are the resources you provide. These are things like skills, time, funds, operations, logistics, stuff like that. Outputs. Outputs are the activities you deliver: exhibitions, workshops, an artist guidebook, a zine, a play. Outcomes and impact is the change that these activities result in. This is tied to the problem you are trying to solve. So that might have an artistic, social, professional development, audience impact. Your activities might have all these impacts. So if we think about the workshop you're attending right now, if all of you gain information after today and are able to develop and fund your own projects, you can easily see how this can be linked to artistic and professional development impact. So CAAP is a space geared to Asians, and therefore there's also a community impact here. Measures are simply how you measure those impacts. So if you want to know if a workshop has been successful and has made an impact on professional development, I might survey you and ask if your knowledge has increased. I can also do a pre-survey in the sign-up form, asking if you had intentions of starting your own projects, and a post-survey after asking if you were successful in delivering a project as a result of gaining skills from this workshop. The method is simply how you're gathering your impact information. So just moving on to the next slide. So here I'm just putting the concepts together based on the previous example that we used, which is the misrepresentation of Asian stories in theatre. That's the issue. So here the inputs are time in the first column, venue, marketing, funds, planning. The outputs in this instance, you've already written it. So it's, you know, the mentoring sessions, the 2 short theatre scripts, 1 performance. Your outcomes or your impact can be broken down into these 4 main areas. There might be others as well, but for, you know, the purpose of this workshop, I'm using these 4 main areas. Our project does not have to meet every impact area, but I've included some here for your consideration. So the measures are the evaluation tools. So they help you ask the right questions in your feedback forms and stuff like that. So if you want to know if your program has deep learning impact on participants, you will have to include a question. So just going to explain the measures a little. So if you're looking at a learning impact, then something that you might measure is the number of participants that report an increase in knowledge. And your method might be observation, conversations, surveys, and things like that. So I hope that that was, you know, that this particular table brings some clarity, you know, gives you some clarity. So now that the core foundations of your project plan is complete, we can move on to the next stage of your project development cycle, and that is the grant guidelines and criteria. So that's in the next slide. Yep. So step 2. It is absolutely essential that you read the guidelines and criteria before selecting a grant for your project. There is no wiggle room with meeting criteria. If the criteria says that you have to meet all 5 criteria points and you only meet 4, there is no point putting a grant application in. Here is also when you pull up that, you know, yearly calendar that I mentioned, where you mapped out all of your grants. And so it's, and you start fitting that into your current project. Widen your options. If you identify as part of the queer community, you can look up LGBTQ grants. If you are leading a project, you can look up leadership grants. Expand your possibilities outside of just arts grants. If your project requires funds beyond $5,000 and you're just starting out, it is best that you have multiple funders or in-kind contributions. When we move on to budgets, I will talk a bit about, you know, how to communicate all of this in your budget itself. In general, grant funders prefer not being the sole funder of a big project. If you're a first-time grant applicant, get your project once again funded in stages. For example, you could get, you know, your scripts funded in one stage, your productions funded in another stage, things like that. And that's why mapping out which grants fit is so important. Grant funders do not want to see you underpaying yourself to get your project done. So once again, you know, if those stages allows you to complete your project and pay yourself a decent fee, it might take longer, but it is a better way to go. Lastly, if you find yourself completely altering the vision of your project to fit the grant criteria, it is not the grant for you. It is best to wait or look elsewhere if you're able to. Just moving on to the next slide. So partnerships and auspicing. So auspicing is, you know, can be quite confusing, and I will talk through this here. So why would you want a partnership or an auspice? Firstly, I want to say that partnerships are usually optional in grants, but in general, incredibly beneficial. Auspicing is sometimes non-negotiable. It's a criteria in your grant application. So partnerships are mutually beneficial relationships between you and others. For example, between you and a not-for-profit organization, which is a very common partnership. But why would you want to partner? So the arts industry can sometimes be guilty of developing projects and expecting community to show up. If you do not have an existing audience, cold marketing often does not work. The funder wants to know how you're getting people to come to your shows outside of your friend groups. So forming mutually beneficial partnerships gives both you and the not-for-profit organization access to an audience. For example, if you're developing a play about the queer community, a good partnership would be an organization like ACON or 2010, a health and testing organization that's working with this community, or a youth-based organization that's working with this community. The community engagement team might want to reach out to a similar demographic at community events, and you're providing this for them by doing a play. In turn, you might gain access to their mailing list, their social media following, which means you can articulate to your funder your reach. If you are able to secure a partnership and include it in your grant application, this shows the funder that you have thought about how you're planning to reach out to an audience and into outside of friends as your audience and into the wider community. So now moving on to auspicing. Auspicing is a type of relationship with a nonprofit organization that helps you administer funds. Many grant funders and philanthropic foundations will not give money to an individual or a sole trader. This means you will need an organization to auspice you. If successful for a grant, the money will actually be administered to the auspicing not-for-profit organization and not directly to you. You will invoice this not-for-profit when you need the money. And I just want to acknowledge that it is a barrier here with auspicing. So your auspicing organization will take between 5 to 10%. I get a lot of questions about this, but yes, they will take some of your grant funding or your grant money, and you can include that in the budget. That's because they're doing work. They're invoicing, they're helping you with that. So some auspicing relationships can be purely financial. Others can be more sort of a partnership kind of situation. So how do you secure a partnership or an auspicing relationship? An initial chat is always good to hear, listen to them. What are their needs, and then prepare a clear one-page proposal outlining, your brief project description, milestones of your project, what you are offering, and clearly state your ask of them. Do not send them a long report. This should be quite easy because if you think about stage one, you've already, done your entire project development. So you're just, cutting and pasting in this instance. So just moving on to the next slide. So supporting material is about showing viability. It is about your past work, and you want to be selective with what you include and place your strongest and most relevant works first. If your funder allows 10 pages, you do not need to fill all 10 pages. Only include relevant content. If you're including a lot of pages, a content page always helps. Include photos, videos, short write-ups. Don't just include text because it can be quite unappealing. The panel's looking through hundreds of applications. All of that, kind of adds to your application, having photos and videos. If you're part of a small collective that hasn't done any projects together yet, include 1 to 2 projects per collective member. Organize your supporting material in a very clear and concise format so that it's, the readability really helps the panel. And now, this brings us to our final step of the process, which is writing and submitting your grant. So general tips before you begin writing your grant. Never write directly in the grant application form. Always pull the core questions out and work in a separate document. Online platforms crash. It will be incredibly unfortunate if all your work disappears. Some application forms are not user-friendly. So you might not be able to see the entirety of your paragraphs that you're writing. The last thing you want is to accidentally leave sentences in draft mode when you submit. At this stage, all you want to do is refer to the materials you've previously worked on and elaborate on the different sections. Read the grant questions carefully and answer what they're asking for. So now I'm going to take you through some core grant questions using the project planning materials that you came up with in stage 1. So just on the next slide. So the first grant question is, tell us about your project. So you've already come up with a short project description. Now they are wanting you to elaborate on it. Some applications might ask slightly more guided questions, so you remain on track. But in this instance, the question is broad and completely unguided. But you can still have a succinct answer. That's what they want. So this structure that we previously used can assist you in developing a concise answer. So let's have a little bit of a look. Okay, so if you're looking at the first column, what is the problem? Problem is the misrepresentation of Asian stories in theater. So now go into detail. Why is this important to your community? Why is it important to you? Why is it important to society or the industry? Why are you working with this demographic? Next column, a mentoring initiative. So what does this mentoring initiative look like? Is it online? Is it in person? How many people are you working with? Next column, the activities. Why 12 sessions? Why is it in this format? The next column, the length of the program. So why 6 months? Why not a year? Why not 3 weeks? So that's when you go through those questions and you elaborate on them. So let's move on to the next grant question. So what is your project milestones? And there you go. They will always ask for your milestones. And you have it because you've already done it. All you have to do is format it into a grant application. So if you have a look at the next slide, basically, I just pulled everything from the table previously and placed it in, a paragraph format. So if you just go back to the next slide, you'll see, all the milestones, planning, research, developing mentoring materials. It's all written out in the next slide, in the grant question. So now moving on to budget. All right, so I'm going to quickly define some terms here. Your income is anything coming in. Your expense is anything going out. Now, if we refer to your milestones table in the previous 2 slides, you will notice that everything in your budget column are expenses. You just have to plug that in. In your income column, these are amounts that are coming in. This is your grant money. This might be ticket sales. This might be crowdfunding. And if you look at row 2, you can see grant 2 pending. You can include pending grants. This shows the funder that you have tried to diversify income sources. Your income also includes in-kind amounts, the 2 rows in orange there. So what is in-kind? And why is it both in your income and expense columns? Kind of confusing, right? So in-kind is anything that is given to you for free, but would normally come with a cost. So if Carriage Works allows you to run a workshop in their rooms for free, you need to account that those rooms are usually rented out at a rate. In this instance, I've just used $700. So volunteer time is another in-kind item. So if a volunteer were not doing this work, you would have to pay someone, and therefore there is a fee. And in this instance, the fee is, $25 an hour for 5 hours. That is income in your project. But why is it also in your expense column? So an expense is anything that you use and you pay for. So while you're receiving the venue amount in kind as income, you are using it at the same time. So if Carriage Works didn't give you the venue in kind, you would be paying for the venue, and it would be an expense. Another example is equipment. So you might be loaned lighting equipment in kind, for example, and that increases your income. But when you use the equipment, the amount goes out. So it's also in your expense column. I hope that that is clear. It's usually a bit confusing. Lastly, I want you to look at the total amounts. They are not the same figure. If you're making you're making a small profit here. Some funders are okay with this, but some require that both numbers are equal and that you are making no profit. And if you are, that the profit is going back into the organization. So read the guidelines once again. I know that this is a glaringly obvious point, but if your expense can never be more than your income. If it is, you are showing the funder that you do not have enough money to run your project. So that does happen, so I just thought I would mention it. So now moving on to the last core grant question, and I know that it's 7 o'clock, but we're right there at the end. So what is the impact of your project? And you've already thought about that. So all you have to do once again is to elaborate on this and move it to a different format. So if you look at the next slide, this is sort of your answer. So, you can basically pull everything from the table and pop it into sort of a paragraph sort of format. I hope that the tools that I provided was useful. I've also included a lot of, guided templates and examples. So, I hope that you can actually use them while you're writing your grant application. So, really the grant application isn't just about writing. The bulk of it is about planning and about whether or not you are ready to deliver. If you set up a structure for your projects prior to looking at the application form, I can assure you that it wouldn't be as tedious as, if you're, first looking at the application form and then, trying to figure out your project from there. And remember to plan ahead of time and slow down if you're encountering if you encounter roadblocks in your planning. This is usually an indicator that there's more to do or more learning to be had prior to the delivery of your project. So just the next slide, please. So another resource that is going to become available in August is a mentoring program that I'm running for artists of color called Holding Space that I recently got a grant for. This is an extension of a mentoring project that I started in February this year. The program will tackle some of the issues that I did encounter and address some of the needs that artists talked about. So in the next few months, I will also be creating and distributing a resource toolkit for artists of color, and we'll begin to run these sustained mentoring sessions. So if you're interested and want to keep updated about the project and you want to get the resource toolkit, we'll leave the link in the chat box and you can just pop your email in there. I know that we have completely run out of time. shall we move on to the Q&A, Arissa, or what do we
do you feel like you've covered what you wanted to?
Yeah. I think, that's basically, the core parts of a grant application and of project development when you're first starting out. So I hope that, all of those tools are useful to everyone here today, and that you're taking back something that, you can really apply to any of your grant applications and projects.
Thank you, Andrea. That was such a full and detailed presentation and tips. I've learned by interrogating our work with these questions and asking ourselves to elaborate further, it really challenges us to articulate our work and our intention.
It is very important, that we are able to figure out what our motivations are for doing what we're doing.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Andrea. I would now like to open up the floor for Q&A. We had some great questions come through. The first one, Andrea, is from Happy Ferraren. Happy is asking, what are some foundations or funding agencies that espouse diversity in media or arts?
I'm not actually particularly sure about, foundations that really target that. That would need some research, but I would encourage you in terms of, government-based funding that, you talk about those issues. It's good for them to also know that these are issues that, our communities face, and they do fund these things. Recently, I got a grant to run these, mentoring sessions for artists of color. So I would encourage you to, be able to really think about what your community needs are, and just apply to grants using those, basically, thinking about, and also asking your community, what do you actually need? And then just applying to grants that fit into your project category.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I just aware of time. I do want to just say, if anyone has to go, I do want to say a quick thank you for attending and a farewell, but we may also, before everybody goes and do a proper thank you and goodbye, I would like to do, if everyone can, if you don't mind, turn the video on, to do a big screenshot of you guys and of everyone. Is that okay? Yay! Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, that's so lovely. Awesome.
That is very lovely. Thank you so much for, attending, and sharing space with me tonight in an especially difficult time. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do a quick shot of everybody. Jules will do a snap. So should I count, Jules? Oh, Jules, you should. Okay, so here we go, everybody. 1, 2, and 3.
Nice. Thanks very much, everyone.
Nice and cheesy, love it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Thank you for your time.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to do this. It's something I really care about. I feel like access to information for our communities is really important. I care a lot about the disparities and in knowledge around that kind of thing. So yes, thank you so much for being here and taking time out of your day to learn about grants, which is quite a hard topic.
Thank you. That was amazing, and thank you to everyone for attending. And But you're right, Andrea. Everybody, please take care and stay safe.
Mm-hmm.
Very difficult time.
Yeah.
And
take care of each other.
Yes, take care of each other. Ooh, that's awesome. And thank you for attending. See you at the next Longhouse. Take care and stay safe.
Take care, everyone.